I want to talk about vaginismus and the problem that we have with dealing with vaginismus going through the usual mainstream approaches. So first of all, what is vaginismus? Vaginismus is a tightening within the muscles. Essentially means that there is some level of pain every time there is any level of touch to penetration. So some people, this pain, this discomfort, this stinging, this stabbing pain can come when there's simply a touch at labia. It can be at labia and it can be during penetration within the vagina. So this could be with a tampon, this could be with fingers, this could be with dilators or anything else where there is something that is going into the muscles. Now, what is this? Well, this is a physical response to unwanted energy in the space. Now, when there is the usual route for vaginismus, what often happens is that somebody will go through the GP where they will often insert a speculum. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, we're in pain because every time there's something that's placed in that space, it creates more pain. When there is a speculum, it is unnecessary for this to be investigated at this point. That should be really taken as there's some level of pain. It needs to be investigated further with a professional that understands what vaginismus or what that space could be presenting with if it's not vaginismus. So then what happens is we have to rule out in that space, they have to rule out things like STIs. So what often happens is someone will go for STI checks, and then they will go down the usual route of ending up in a gynae's space. Now, the problem that we have in the NHS is that the NHS are not equipped to deal with a psychosomatic condition, such as vaginismus. Most of the things that come up within the pelvis, unless it's like an STI, for example, are a result of a emotional, spiritual and physical holding pattern within the pelvis. And until we are marrying up even the spiritual, emotional and physical, until that happens in spaces like the NHS, then they will not be equipped to deal with things like vaginismus, vulvodynia or anything else that is a physical manifestation within the space that cannot be dealt with just with a physical approach. Vaginismus cannot be dealt with simply with dilators or any other physical approach. They have to deal with the emotional holding of the space. Why is this the case? Well, because vaginismus is a condition that appears as a result of trauma, as a result of some level of trauma, some level of challenge that has existed, and it is a protective mechanism that has come into play where the muscles basically freeze to prevent further insertion of what or any other touch. Now, for some people listening to this who may have vaginismus and are thinking, well, I don't remember any trauma or I don't know what that might mean for me in terms of the journey that I've been on, that's where you need to go on a journey of investigation with what it is that might be coming up. So that's where spaces like mine that weave in the spiritual, emotional and physical holding pattern of the pelvis will allow for anybody to explore why vaginismus is here in the first place. Now, what often happens is there are several approaches. So these approaches can include dilators, where they're basically dilating the pelvis to try and make the space bigger and bigger. What that does is create pain and discomfort, and unintentionally, in my opinion, and doesn't actually deal with the challenge to hand. The other thing that can come up is they might end up working with somebody with antidepressants. They might basically antidepressants, there is something within the antidepressants which they believe can support with this mechanism that occurs within the pelvis. It is a really challenging topic for me to be with because I do not believe that antidepressants should be used in this space for that. What that is doing is completely and utterly shutting down the woman and the woman's voice even further without acknowledging why there is this manifestation in the first place. So the other thing that they might have is they might offer some level of counselling, but the counselling ignores things like the necessity to go into the discussion of whether there has been a trauma, and sometimes that trauma is rape, and the spaces that exist are not equipped and are not able to support the person as much as probably possible and as needed when it comes to dealing with the discussion of that level of trauma, such as a rape trauma, such as PTSD. So I have first-hand experience in my space with women, witnessing them go through a long journey to get to the point where they land in my space, where they have often been through some of these supportive approaches, which in turn do not support the woman and create further challenge, further disconnect. And the problem that you have is that we sometimes have to go on that journey to realize that there's more for us. So that's absolutely as it's meant. As frustrating and as anger-inducing as it is, essentially it does come down to the fact that we have to find spaces like mine who weave in a full-bodied approach in order to move through the challenge and in order to create and repattern the pelvis as it is. So spaces exist in a holistic manner, and often because my kind of space is still quite new to the holistic world, even though it's not new at all, but it's new in a society that we live in at the moment. Sometimes people will go through acupuncture, which I'm a real big fan of acupuncture, or they might go through reflexology, or they might go through talking therapy, or any of those kind of things that are deemed more mainstream. But the challenge is that you're not being with the actual space that's coming up with the challenge. So in order to move through vaginismus, the key points to move through vaginismus in a holistic manner, which mean that you're dealing with the psychosomatic condition which the NHS do not support with, is you're weaving in the emotional pattern of the space and understanding where the vaginismus stems from. Vaginismus, as the NHS likes to share quite heavily, as well as gaslight, they like to share that the vaginismus itself will go away at some point. Now, what can often happen is that someone can change partners and it can go away, or somebody can change jobs or change where they live or change something quite drastic, and it tends to go away in its own time for some. Not always, but for some. For some, it goes away and comes back. For some, they think it's gone away and then it will come back in a few months, few years. But the problem you have is that unless you're actually dealing with vaginismus, then you're not actually able to be with the idea that when or if it ever comes back and presents itself, you don't have the tools in order to move it again easily. You'll come back to this perpetual fear that it's here to stay, that people call themselves broken. And what we really need to understand is where it's stemming from in the first place, the tools that we can be with to move it through, and an environment that supports us to be with everything that vaginismus brings up. What we need are spaces like mine. What we need are these spaces. And I talk about it so positively because this is what I see in my space, as I see such beautiful transformation, such hope, and a completely different approach to what somebody has been dealing with for sometimes 20 years. And so what we really have to acknowledge is that we need to work with the holding pattern emotionally, first and foremost, somatically, and then at some point the space will be ready to move with physically, and that looks like working with the fascia. And while working with the fascia, we weave in the emotional holding. So when someone comes to me for a massage touch, which happens over time, they end up with the space being moved through emotionally. So I move with questions that I know will support with the movement within that fascia space. Now, it often sounds so out there and so challenging to wrap our heads around that people are often like, what does that mean? What does that look like? I truly like to think of it as like a reading of the vagina. The holding pattern is a reading of the vagina. And what is the holding pattern showing and telling us? So we're more and more aware of things like a tarot reading or reading of the cards or reading of someone's body pattern, someone's facial expressions. So we're reading the vagina and what the vagina is telling us, and sometimes what the labia are telling us as well. So then when we've been with that, I often advise that somebody goes away and does that touch for themselves, having experienced it with me, and then they might come back again. I always encourage people to come back into my space, and I actually really encourage people to come to me as a feminine, what my mentor would say is like an MOT. So it's like coming back and really having that supportive space to come back to again and again and again over once a year, every year, moving forward, to really ensure that we are being supportive with what's there. There will be a time when a vagina massage is as supportive, as necessary as any other holistic space. And until we get to that point, we will continue to find ourselves with these kind of manifestations that aren't tended to by the feminine, because it's a feminine space, and so it needs to be tended to by the feminine, not in a environment like bright lights, bed, not supportive. It's not going to be supportive for the woman. When you think about birth and what a woman needs to birth, they need to birth in the darkness. If you think about like a cat, when they're birthing, that's how we mirror birth. It's like that dark, oxytocin rich space. That's the same space that needs to be created when dealing with something like vaginismus. It's the same thing. The other thing that people often say is that it goes away by themselves. They've had it and then they don't ever have it again, or haven't had it again, and they're a bit like, that was a weird time in my life. If somebody is watching this and somebody has been in that space, I highly recommend that they still come to work with what's there. Because even if it's just say it never comes back ever again, there's still that real time of where you weren't held and weren't tended to. And I highly recommend coming into that space to be held and to be tended to in a way that really is warranted after going through that experience, whether months ago or years ago. So to work with vaginismus, I offer a one-to-one space for people to come and work with me. The link is in the below to book a first call. The first call is a really beautiful space to explore a form that's really in depth and explores someone's journey to this point, explores what their holding pattern might be showing, and really enables us to be with what would be tended to in our space together, and allows us to explore how working together would look. I also offer one-to-one ceremonies. I often say that with vaginismus, it would be great to have more than one space, because one ceremony doesn't necessarily move if the vaginismus is still present, the challenge of vaginismus, but it certainly gives you many tools, and it certainly gives you that experience of being held. So I'm sending so much love, and I'm here with any questions. I'm always an email away.